Thank you very much, Ian. In fact, I'm going to focus almost entirely on the digital Laocoon. I'm saying Laocoon. I've had several years to get used to pronouncing that correctly. It's not that easy. But I'm going to start, I think, in a slightly unusual place to highlight one of the key research themes behind this. And this is looking at this object here, which some of you may recognize. This is it's known as the Utah Teapot. It's the very first three-dimensional object that was ever captured in computer graphics by Martin Newell back in the 1970s. It was an entirely digital object, and it's become iconic in computer graphics. It turns up all over the place in 3D modeling packages, as little Easter eggs in various films, Toy Story, and lots of others. But what really struck me about it as being quite interesting is that when we look at how it's treated as a heritage object, if we go to the Computer History Museum, what we discover is that it's the physical teapot that's been ingested into the museum. So the least important point about this object is its physical manifestation. In fact, it is a few lines of code, and it's a true digital object that has an interest and a heritage in its own right. And that's kind of the starting point for this research. And it's not thinking necessarily about the digital heritage objects that we create in reference to the original objects. It's those objects as effective items that have a life and a meaning in their own right. So there's been a lot of research about this, how this might be done, the relationship between a digital replica and its original, and how that replica can become an effective object in its own right. And through the work of people like the Turin Rowe, Fiona Cameron, Sarah Kenderdine, in fact, there's been a lot of elements have been identified that allow a digital object to generate its own value and its own erratic quality. For example, the intentionality of the production. There's a lot made about the quality and the expenditure of resources in that production. But latterly, we've begun to think about the networks of people involved in that production process and how that influences how the object is received in its own right. And there was a couple of projects I was involved in over the last few years, which looked very closely at that by engaging in co-production of digital objects. One was the Accord project, working with about 10 community groups across Scotland, and more recently, Scotland's Rock Art project, where the records of the rock art, almost entirely done through Structure for Motion, are being co-produced with community groups. And there's about 2,500 records that we're dealing with there. But moving on to my main case study, we have, unfortunately, a calamity in 2014. As we know, the Macintosh building of the Glasgow School of Art was quite badly damaged in a fire. Almost immediately after that, well, in fact, absolutely immediately after that, there was a large laser scanning exercise undertaken by SimVis in partnership with Historic Environment Scotland. And the main image there is a cut plane image through that laser scan of the entire building, and you can see most of the damage over there in the right of the image. Almost incidentally to that recording exercise, because we were focused really on the structure of the building to help in its conservation and reconstruction, we caught quite a lot of the objects from within it, including some of the remaining elements of Glasgow School of Art's plaster cast collection. And we can see in the back, I don't know if you can see, in the middle of the screen, right at the back, there's a man in obvious pain. That is Laocoon, and that's a plaster cast of this object here. So the Laocoon group was discovered in just outside Rome in about 1506. It became a sensation in art historical terms, and there was a huge number of plaster casts generated of it. Interestingly, the marble version that was uncovered in 1506 is believed to be the copy of an original bronze from the Hellenistic period. So we've got quite an interesting line of extension here, starting with a lost bronze, a marble copy of that bronze, a plaster cast of the marble copy, possibly several generations of plaster cast, and then a digital version of it. So out of the calamity of the fire came an opportunity to work with that digital version. There was a funding call went out via the AHRC and the EPSRC called Memory, Place and Performance, which seemed to fit very much with what we wanted to do with this digital version of the Laocoon. And this was to generate an immersive experience. So the idea was that we'd take a user-centered approach, a design approach, and we'd co-design and develop the interactive content. So previously we'd be working with co-production and co-design with community groups, now very broad community groups. Now we're looking at communities of interest specifically around the Macintosh and the plaster cast, and this involved staff, students, archivists from the buildings, art historians. Thea Stevens, who we know in the call, was closely involved in this, the architects, and this kind of broader community of interest around the Macintosh and the art school, including the Hunterian Museum. So a lot of the production work was done very closely with ISO Design, commercial SME, who are award-winning through a number of projects, such as our work on the Titanic in Belfast and also Immersives down in Stonehenge. Just as a side note, it's a relatively low budget project, and it was done on relatively short timescales. But the key point is about what we wanted to do. So there's a user-centered linear VR experience that is in itself a creative response. So this was meant for the reopening exhibition of the Macintosh School after it was reconstructed. And the important point is that the object we were creating is specifically an extension of that long biography associated with the Laocoon. It's part of the same story. It doesn't sit separately on its own. And that's why in this context and others, we've been thinking of referring to these types of objects as extended objects, because they extend forward and backwards into the biography of the original. So in this exercise, users are taken through a series of virtual spaces. They encounter quite a lot of rich and diverse content. So this is this multi-layered stories that was referred to earlier on. The history of the Laocoon, its role in the Macintosh, the art historical significance of the Laocoon, its damage and the restoration process are extensively documented in this immersive. And it's also self-referencing to the position of the digital replica. So the information about the production of the replica and production of the digital object are incorporated into the object we're producing. So this is an idea of some screenshots for it, and it shows you how we went about doing that. So there's a life-sized Laocoon, which you can walk around and investigate. There's a lot of content which is gaze activated. So essentially, simply by looking at a particular place or looking at a particular element, further information pops up from that. So the user interface was actually quite smooth. And I think an important point to make about this is that calamity on calamity is that after the restoration process of the plaster cast, it was put back into the Macintosh building and unfortunately completely destroyed in the second fire of 2018. So we've got quite an interesting biography developing, starting with the lost bronze original, having multiple iterations of the object, finishing with a creative response, a digital object, which in actual fact is the only remaining step from the plaster cast, which is now no longer with us, is now being destroyed. So I know we don't have a lot of time for this, but I just want to give you a quick flavour of the walkthrough, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges I think we faced with it.
This is Laocoon. Legend has it he was a Trojan priest who, along with his 2 sons, was attacked by sea serpents sent by the gods. The story's most iconic depiction is a marble sculpture from ancient Greece that is now in the Vatican, that many believe to be a copy of an earlier bronze work. You are looking at a plaster replica of the central figure that existed in the Glasgow School of Art's Macintosh building. From the time of its rediscovery, copies of Laocoon and his sons were made in marble and in plaster. Many were used for teaching drawing and anatomy in art schools where collections of casts were wheeled between studios for students to work from.
I'm just going to move on a little bit to have a look at the gaze-activated content around.
And suddenly, the fire had turned them into something completely different again.
So this is now discussing the conservation process that was being undertaken on the fire-damaged original.
The plaster itself. We drilled holes into the Laocoon's body. One was to
3D printing. It can be rendered and textured.
So this is the element towards the end where we're actually talking about the production of the digital replica itself and the affordances that that digital replica actually allows us. So there's a YouTube link there which I would encourage people to go and have a look at the walkthrough in full. But I'd like to finish on a few reflections around the experience. First one, I think this has been touched upon already in terms of accessibility and isolation, is that this was a full immersive delivered via an Oculus Rift device, massive shepherding and health and safety issues. People were in an installation situation, people are not allowed on their own to put on a headset, especially a tailored headset, and walk around a space. They need to be observed to do that, simply to stop them from walking into things. So there was some interesting elements of that had to be considered. And kind of in tandem to that is the transitions from physical to virtual modes can be abrupt and dissonant. It's quite a strange experience going from a brightly lit room full of other people, putting on a headset and being plunged into a quite dissonant environment. And that's something I think we should be looking on and working on. I also, and this speaks more to my own personal prejudices, is there's elements of the production of digital heritage objects that we don't manifest fully. For example, authorship. The actual authorship of the creative object, the work of art in essence, are often obscured and corporatized. So they tend to be the production of an organisation, Historic Environment Scotland, Glasgow School of Art, rather than being attributed to the individuals who are working on it. Not only does this obscure the hand of the artist or the hand of the technician, it also speaks to that question we were touching on earlier around bias. By trying to remove the individuals from it, it changes the flavour of how we consume it. Similarly with ownership, I'm not going to go on about that too much, but I would finish on another aspect, and I think this is an opportunity looking forward, and I was really excited to see Sarah's work earlier on this morning, but this is to do with the particular affordances of some of the digital content, and it's the network of the Laocoon. It's this idea that what we've produced actually fits in a giant network of other Laocoons. There's an image there from Sketchfab. There's about 50 or so digital versions. There's literally hundreds of plaster casts around the world. There's a whole range of really interesting pre-existing creative responses around the Laocoon. Here's one of my favorite, which is Tyler and Hammond's production of the Laocoon as the skeletons. So one of the things you can do with the digital is stop it from being an isolated system, stop it from just being a thing on its own, and start integrating it into these broader networks. So we started in this talk, I think, with communities as networks involved in the production, and then we went on to think about the communities of interest around something like the Macintosh. I just think it's a really interesting area to look at these broader communities out there and how we can instantiate them inside the digital object itself. I'll leave it there if that's all right.